What if a major religion's sacred scripture was actually proven to be a forgery? And then what if that same church tried to hide it, but then later admitted that the critics were right? I'm Cameron Bertuzzi with Capturing Christianity, and right now we're about to uncover Mormonism's darkest secret, a text called the Book of Abraham. In just the next few minutes, you'll see evidence so damning it forced Mormon leaders to completely change their story. And by the end of this video, you'll know why every reputable scholar calls it a fraud and how the church reacted when the truth got out. Our story begins in 1835 in the bustling town of Kirtland, Ohio, headquarters of the fledgling Mormon Church. A traveling showman named Michael Chandler arrived with a fascinating exhibit, 4 Egyptian mummies and a collection of papyrus scrolls. Rumor had it that these were genuine artifacts from ancient Egypt, and they stirred curiosity everywhere that they went. Joseph Smith, the founding prophet of Mormonism, was intrigued. Chandler sold him several papyrus fragments along with the mummies for a hefty sum, about $2,400 in 19th century money, which was a small fortune at the time. Almost immediately, Smith announced that one of these scrolls contained the lost writings of the biblical Abraham, a blockbuster claim given that Abraham is revered by Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. The only problem? They needed to be translated. Fortunately, we're dealing with the master of translating ancient documents. So then how did Joseph Smith supposedly translate these papyrus fragments that contained Egyptian hieroglyphs, which were still a mystery in America? The answer lies in the notebooks he kept, the so-called Egyptian alphabet and grammar documents. In these pages, Smith and his scribes lined up Egyptian symbols from the scrolls, then wrote out entire English paragraphs alongside them. He insisted this was a divinely guided translation, the same method he'd used to produce the Book of Mormon just a few years earlier. And what's in the finished product? Joseph Smith's translation became known as the Book of Abraham. It opens with Abraham nearly being sacrificed by a pagan priest, and then narrates his travels to Egypt and revelations about the cosmos, claiming to reveal deep truths about the creation of the world. Smith declared it scripture, teaching it to his followers as a genuine record of Abraham himself. But if Joseph Smith believed this was truly an authentic ancient document, you'd expect the original papyri to be preserved at all costs, right? That's what makes the next part of this story so puzzling. Sometime after Smith's death in 1844, his widow, Emma Smith, and other relatives ended up selling the mummies and the papyri to different collectors. Portions of the scrolls were moved around over the years, even lost or destroyed, until fragments resurfaced in the 20th century. If this really was the lost Book of Abraham, the very words of a biblical patriarch, why would it be so casually sold off like a mere curiosity? But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, all right? At first, 19th century Mormons actually believed him. After all, not many people could translate Egyptian in America back then. But as scholars in Europe unlocked the secrets of hieroglyphs using the Rosetta Stone, they began comparing Joseph Smith's Book of Abraham to actual Egyptian. What they found would haunt the Mormon Church for well over a century. In just a moment, I'll tell you how these revelations forced a crisis inside of Mormonism, plus the exact quotes from their leadership who dismissed the critics as biased, so don't go anywhere. Now, in case you're not familiar with the content of Joseph Smith's so-called Book of Abraham, it isn't just a quaint retelling of Bible stories. In fact, it introduces radical new ideas that clash with mainstream Judaism and Christianity. If you believe that this is truly ancient scripture, you're forced to accept doctrines that were unheard of in the 19th century. So let me show you just a couple examples. All right, so number 1, the gods in the creation story, Abraham 4:1. And then the Lord said, "Let us go down." And they went down at the beginning, and they, that is the gods, organized and formed the heavens and the earth. In this verse, Joseph Smith depicts the gods shaping and planning creation, a far cry from the singular, all-powerful God of the Bible. This verse and others like it turn Abraham, literally the father of monotheism, into a polytheist. Number 2, premortal existence and intelligences. Abraham 3:22 through 23. Now the Lord has shown unto me, Abraham, the intelligences that were organized before the world was, and among all these were many of the noble and great ones. In this chapter of the book of Abraham, Abraham is granted a vision of the premortal existence. In verses 22 through 23, he sees, quote, intelligences that were organized before the world was, and among them many, quote, noble and great ones. This scene is central to Mormon teachings on the premortal life, where all human spirits are believed to have lived in God's presence before being born on earth. This doctrine, if we can call it one, is found nowhere in canonical Jewish or mainstream Christian scriptures. It suggests that people had a premortal life, an idea that Mormons would later make central to their theology. If this text really came from the biblical Abraham, it means the world's 3 major Abrahamic faiths have been missing huge chunks of doctrine for centuries. And if it's not authentic, then all of these new doctrines are grounded in nothing more than Joseph Smith's imagination. The stakes, therefore, could not be higher, and that's exactly why scholars soon began to question whether this really was an ancient record of Abraham or something else entirely. Starting in the mid-1800s, a handful of Egyptologists got a peek at Joseph Smith's published facsimiles, those detailed Egyptian scenes included with the Book of Abraham. Nearly all said the same thing. These illustrations look like ordinary Egyptian funerary vignettes. There's no mention of Abraham. The big explosion came in 1912. Episcopal Bishop F.S. Spalding mailed the Book of Abraham facsimiles to 8 recognized Egyptologists and scholars, including James H. Breasted at the University of Chicago and A.H. Sayce at Oxford. Their responses were devastating. Breasted politely but firmly dismissed Smith's claims as uninformed. The legendary Flinders Petrie said that there was not one single word of truth in Smith's explanations. A.H. Sayce of Oxford called it an imprudent fraud. Now here's what might surprise you. The Mormon leadership did not concede or even seem rattled. Instead, they fired back. In February 1913, the church's first presidency published a letter in the Improvement era. They insisted these scholars were simply biased and lacked the spiritual insight to judge Scripture. Essentially, they brushed off top Egyptologists as people who just didn't get it because they weren't Mormons. So what we have here is the Mormon Church effectively labeling these respected academics as biased, maintaining that the Book of Abraham was still genuine. But this is only the beginning of a battle that would continue for decades. Now let's pull back the curtain on something called the Kirtland Egyptian Papers. This is a set of documents from Joseph Smith's time containing lines of Egyptian symbols from the Book of Abraham Papyri, and next to each symbol are entire paragraphs of English translation. Here's why this is a big deal. Modern Egyptology, which can accurately read hieroglyphs, confirms that each Egyptian character is typically just a word or part of a word, not entire sentences. Yet Joseph Smith appears to assign whole chunks of text to single characters, suggesting he was inventing or reverse engineering his translation. This is exactly what critics like Gerald and Sandra Tanner pointed out in the 1960s when they got copies of these papers. And guess how the Mormon Church reacted? By keeping these manuscripts in their archives away from the general public for decades, until they were effectively leaked. This is one of many reasons scholars now say the Book of Abraham could not be what Joseph Smith claimed. But let's keep going, because the biggest bombshell came in the 1960s when the original papyri were rediscovered. In 1966, curators at the Metropolitan Museum of Art discovered fragments of papyrus that once belonged to Joseph Smith. In 1967, they returned these fragments to the Mormon Church. For the first time in over a century, modern Egyptologists could directly study the exact scrolls from which Joseph claimed to have translated the Book of Abraham. And surprise, surprise, every expert determined that these were not Abraham's writings at all. They turned out to be funerary texts, including something called the Book of Breathings, an Egyptian work intended to help the deceased navigate the afterlife. They even mentioned a dead man named Hor, not Abraham. Now, if you're thinking surely this forced the Mormon Church to repudiate the Book of Abraham, well, let's see how they handled it. Before I continue, I just want to say if you're finding this content helpful or if you appreciate these deep dives in theology, take a moment to subscribe to Capturing Christianity, hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments. We've got way more content coming your way and I don't want you to miss any of it. All right, now let's talk about how the Mormon Church reacted after the papyri were returned. By the late 1960s, the evidence was becoming undeniable. The surviving papyrus fragments didn't match Joseph Smith's Book of Abraham. When the Mormon Church finally published photographs of these papyri in the Improvement Era magazine, they had to acknowledge they were standard funerary texts, a major blow to the old claim that these scrolls literally contained Abraham's writings. Yet, instead of repudiating the Book of Abraham, church leaders pivoted. Two principal theories emerged to reconcile the facts. Number one, the missing scroll theory, and number two, the catalyst theory. We're going to see how the Mormon Church officially responded to this in a minute, but let's first debunk each of these theories in turn and explain why they both collapse under the weight of Joseph Smith's own writings. Now first, the missing scroll theory suggests that the actual text containing Abraham's story was on another portion of the papyrus that's now lost. Since the rediscovered fragments don't mention Abraham, proponents claim Joseph Smith must have worked from a different section, one we simply don't have today. On the surface, this might sound somewhat plausible, at least to some people, but here's the catch. Joseph Smith's own notebooks, sometimes called the Egyptian alphabet and grammar, include images of the exact Egyptian characters that correspond directly to the published verses of the Book of Abraham. We can literally see the hieroglyphs on one side and the Egyptian translation on the other, detailing Abraham's story. Modern Egyptologists, including Dr. Robert K. Rittner and Dr. Klaus Baer, confirm these same characters come from the very fragments the church holds. The ones we know are funerary texts that have nothing to do with Abraham. In other words, it's not some long-lost scroll. The exact hieroglyphs Joseph Smith claimed were about Abraham line up with the manuscripts we do have, and they're all about Egyptian funerary rites for a deceased man named Hor, not Abraham. This fact alone eviscerates the missing scroll theory. The Book of Abraham text we see in Joseph Smith manuscript is clearly derived from the same papyrus still in existence. The second theory is what many modern Mormons lean on, the catalyst theory. It proposes that Joseph Smith wasn't doing a literal translation from Egyptian. Instead, he was simply inspired by the papyri or used them as a kind of divine prompt to receive new revelation. The Book of Abraham then is said to be scripture in a spiritual sense, regardless of what the scrolls literally say. But here's the problem with this, at least one of the problems. Joseph Smith himself consistently called this work a translation. In the original 1842 publication in Times and Seasons, he literally titled it, quote, "a translation of some ancient records," purporting to be the writings of Abraham. And these same Egyptian alphabet notebooks repeatedly show him matching specific hieroglyphic characters to large blocks of English text. He didn't claim to be receiving spiritual revelation. He claimed he was reading Egyptian. If this was purely catalytic, then why take the trouble to copy each hieroglyph and produce an Egyptian alphabet and grammar? Why did Joseph say he was translating from the papyri, not merely receiving revelation out of thin air? The very existence of these translation manuscripts undercuts the notion that he never meant it as a literal translation. Joseph Smith explicitly said he was decoding Egyptian, not just using it to spark spiritual insight. Moreover, the Book of Abraham facsimiles published in Mormon scripture come with Smith's detailed explanations of the Egyptian figures. Egyptologists maintain every figure is misidentified, gods labeled as biblical characters, references to papyri, parts that don't appear in the Book of Abraham narrative, and so on. If this purely was a catalyst, why present incorrect translations of actual Egyptian? There's simply no room for maybe he used a different scroll, nor is it consistent with purely spiritual revelation. Joseph repeatedly insisted he was translating actual Egyptian script, which we now know doesn't mention Abraham at all. So when you hear modern Mormon apologists mention the missing scroll or a catalyst, remember we have Joseph Smith's notebooks, in which he literally calls it a translation and includes the exact hieroglyphs. And yet, even with the evidence laid bare, Mormon leaders haven't publicly disavowed the Book of Abraham. Coming up next, we'll see how the church continued to officially embrace the Book of Abraham and what happened when they finally admitted the rediscovered papyri didn't contain Abraham's story at all. So stay with me. As of 2014, the Mormon Church officially states, and I quote, "None of the characters on the papyrus fragments mentioned Abraham's name or any of the events recorded in the Book of Abraham." Latter-day Saint and non-Latter-day Saint Egyptologists agree that the characters on the fragments do not match the translation given in the Book of Abraham. Though there is not unanimity, even among non-Latter-day Saint scholars, about the proper interpretation of the vignettes on these fragments. Scholars have identified the papyrus fragments as parts of standard funerary texts that were deposited with mummified bodies. These fragments date to between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE, long after Abraham lived. The veracity and value of the Book of Abraham cannot be settled by scholarly debate concerning the book's translation and historicity. The book's status as scripture lies in the internal truths it teaches and the powerful spirit it conveys. Let's think about that. So in 1912, Mormon leaders dismissed scholars who said exactly this, calling them self-styled experts. And over a century later, the church basically says, yeah, they were right. The papyri doesn't read like Joseph claimed, but we believe the Book of Abraham is scripture anyways. This is a pretty big evolution, but the question is, does this salvage the Book of Abraham or confirm that it's a 19th century forgery? So let's dig even deeper. For many Mormons who learn about this, it causes a pretty big faith crisis. After all, Joseph Smith claimed he was translating actual Egyptian characters, yet the real text of these scrolls is about Egyptian gods, not Abraham. So either one, Joseph Smith couldn't actually translate Egyptian, making the Book of Abraham a product of his own imagination, or two, it's some inspired text wholly disconnected from the papyri's literal meaning. Plenty of former Mormons cite the Book of Abraham controversy as the tipping point for leaving the church, arguing it undermines Joseph Smith's credibility as a prophet. Meanwhile, the official position of the Mormon Church is that the spiritual truths in the Book of Abraham are what matter, not the historical details. However you slice it, the fact remains the scrolls Joseph Smith used have nothing to do with Abraham. So if you're a Mormon, that's something you have to wrestle with. But hold on, because we're still not done. After everything that we've learned, the question becomes unavoidable. What does this evidence actually point to? If Joseph Smith truly was a prophet, would he buy ancient Egyptian manuscripts and then incorrectly translate them, implying he discovered some long-lost scripture from Abraham's own hand? Or is that exactly the kind of thing that we'd expect from a false prophet? Let's think clearly about this. We have his notebooks. We literally have them, the Egyptian alphabet and grammar, where he insists that each hieroglyph yields lines of English. We have the facsimiles he said depicted Abraham's story, but which modern Egyptologists identify as standard funerary scenes of gods like Anubis and Osiris. And we have the original papyri themselves, which turned out to be spells for a dead man named Hor. No matter which theory that you actually choose, missing scroll, catalyst theory, or something else, the simplest explanation is that Joseph Smith wasn't actually translating Egyptian. If he got it all wrong, how is that consistent with true prophetic ability? If he were faking all of this, this is exactly the scenario we would expect. For devout Mormons, this might be unsettling because the Book of Abraham is woven into their scripture, literally in their scripture, shaping central core doctrines. And yet here we are staring at mountains of evidence that it's not an authentic ancient record. So we have to face the reality. Would a genuine prophet of God produce a text that so blatantly contradicts its own source material? Or is this precisely what happens when someone is just making it up? Now, you can decide that for yourself, but from an unbiased, objective perspective, the evidence overwhelmingly suggests Joseph Smith's Book of Abraham wasn't translated at all. It was fabricated, and that forces a sobering conclusion about Smith's claim to being a true prophet. prophet of God. So was Joseph Smith a true prophet, or was he a fraud? Given everything that we've seen, there's only one answer that fits the facts. Unfortunately, there's an alternative. Christianity is true.